if you talk to any woman, whether Chinese women or women from other countries that are living here, working here, they immediately talk about how safe it is to walk in the streets. I'm not saying there's no violence against women, but it is palpable how different it is compared to, any major cities pretty much in the world. And that means a lot in terms of just, wow, as women, you can go around at night and feel like you don't have to plan every single moment of your life being like, how am I going to get home from that meeting? How am I going to get point A to point B? If the metro stops, what can I do? That daily life, that we have to do pretty much anywhere. Here, it's a much more like relieved parts.
Welcome to the No Cold War Britain podcast, where we're bringing you in-depth discussions every month on the key issue of our time, stopping the US Cold War offensive and Britain's role in this major threat to world peace and prosperity. We're very happy to be bringing you voices from Britain and internationally to be delving deeper into why this new Cold War is happening, what dangers it presents, and how we can build a movement to stop it. I'm Fiona Edwards, and my co-host is Ileana Chan.
Hi. If you like the work that we've been doing, please remember to subscribe and like our YouTube channel.
This is our second episode, and we're really honoured to be joined by Tings Chak, who's based in Beijing. Tings is an internationalist activist, a writer, an artist, born in Hong Kong and grew up in the migrant justice movement in Canada. She is the art director and a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. She is the co-founding editor of Dongsheng, a collective of international researchers interested in Chinese politics and society, and she's currently pursuing a doctorate at Tsinghua University in Beijing. Tings, it's a real honor to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Fiona and Ileana.
Well, yes, fantastic to have you here. And one of the things I wanted to ask you to begin with is your perspective living in China. And what is the perspective of the Chinese people and the Chinese state to this new Cold War? What is the level of awareness amongst the Chinese public about the US offensive against their country? Because that's not something we hear very much about in the West.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important question because if, according to the West, it doesn't seem like 1.4 billion Chinese people have a voice or have opinions about what is going on. But I have to say that there has been a very strong sort of, I would call it even an awakening of many Chinese people, starting with the Obama's pivot to Asia, but really sparked by the Trump's trade war, and then which has only been deepened in the Biden administration. And in some ways, that has helped a process of sort of de-idealizing the United States and seeing the United States for what it really is. And especially in the Trump days, there was some jokes circulating around of calling Trump Comrade Trump, because he actually helped construct the nation in the sense of, through its sanctions, force the people in China to sort of come together and have to rethink a lot of its position and relationship with U.S. and the U.S.-led West. But I think from the sort of people's feeling is the word, I would say, imperialism has come back as part of the lexicon. Remembering that during the opening of reform decades, really, that was a word that was kind of shied away from. This is different from, let's say, the Mao era, the early socialist period, because it was a part of the rapprochement and building good ties with the West, integrating into the international order, let's call it. But in the recent years, there's been a very strong sense that imperialism and anti-imperialism is back, and with always a historical look, because Chinese people have a long historical memory and always refer back to history, and really the imperialist history, thinking about the century of humiliation, which is an important period of history where actually the same kinds of countries today are leading the sort of new Cold War. We're also countries that were, colonizing or taking advantage of, et cetera, Chinese people in China. And so there's a lot of that history also being revived and thought about in this current moment, even though China is in a very different position. And so in some senses, I think you've seen a kind of a stronger China in responding to what we see as imperialist aggressions in the form of sanctions, media warfare, what have you. And I think the West has kind of use it as in a derisory way to talk about so-called wolf warriors, from the official tone of, Chinese diplomats actually having strong words against, U.S. aggressions. But the thing is, that isn't just about, sloganeering or trying to act tough. This actually represents a lot of the feelings of people. I remember I'll give one example is, remember back in Alaska when Antony Blinken and Yang Jiechi met, which is a top diplomat in China. They met and, in the middle of this sort of new Cold War moment. And he had some very strong words, with gesturing with his hands, responding to Blinken and saying something like, U.S. is not qualified to talk to China from a position of strength, based on its own track record. And these quotes became like popular cell phone covers, for example, or T-shirts, or, they're very much things that represented a lot of people's feelings of, no, we're not going to just sit here and take the aggressions, that we aren't the China of 100 years ago that got trampled over on. We're going to stand up for ourselves. And in some ways, I think that is something that we've seen. And in a way, I think for myself, it's a welcome kind of awakening in that sense. There's a kind of politicization that's also happening, particularly amongst younger people.
Yeah, I remember that moment, as for me, it was like the first time I heard a line like that from China. So I felt it was welcome personally. But you've lived in China for a few years now. Could you tell us some interesting ways in which living in China differs from how China is portrayed by the West in media?
It almost feels like what's not different, because it's just so different. And I was thinking, I'm like, okay, even if you flip through like any, news portals or magazines or something of the West, it feels like it's an authoritarian dystopia, 1.4 billion people are just like one gray, miserable, unthinking mass. And like the whole humanity, the fact that we're human beings is completely, erased from that individuals with aspirations and opinions and lots of them. But I guess one of the things is, I don't know if it's comforting or not, but in this new Cold War, especially through the media, I think it's not that new. It actually has a very long history. Where anti-Chinese propaganda is as old as, I don't know, colonialism. And I always think back sometimes especially because I work in the area of arts and culture, I'm thinking a lot about media representation often, is that, it reminds me of a lot of the cartoons, back in the 19th century, of the xenophobic cartoons. There's a very famous one, I'm sure maybe many of your listeners have seen, this Australian cartoon where China is this octopus with like many tentacles, and on the tentacle strangling, helpless white people in the image. And then the tentacles wrote all sorts of words, there were like words like, immortality, immorality, bribery, like all sorts of diseases and cheap labor. I think in that sense, that image of China or Chinese people as sort of inscrutable cheats and can't be trusted, and they're out to steal the good things from, the West, it's kind of age old, and it's kind of, what we're seeing today in a slightly different packaging. And that hasn't really changed. We saw that during the period of, overt colonization, but then we see this again repeated in the anti-communist McCarthyism, and now today in this new Cold War era, in a way, kind of recycled and boring narratives, I would say. But I think that's the Western media part. But I think one of the things that are not only my experience, but especially receiving different friends from different countries, then when you get to come to see China for yourself, you'll notice immediately. And there's a couple of things I can think of. Usually everyone always asks, after walking on any street in any city in China, they'll say, why aren't there homeless people? Why aren't there slums? And, the vast homelessness of the global north, but also the massive slums of the global south. Why isn't there that, and start asking questions. Okay, something is different here than the capitalist West. Last night I was just walking with some friends, newly made friends who are coming for a conference. They're, from Africa and Latin America. And they were surprised with how few police there were here in Beijing. And they were even surprised to see, oh, the police officers are, in little dinky electric bikes and are unarmed, don't carry guns. And that's the so-called police state that we're, apparently living here. And other things, that you feel really palpable, people talk a lot about the surveillance or the surveillance state that China is. But if you talk to any woman, whether Chinese women or women from other countries that are living here, working here, they immediately talk about how safe it is to walk in the streets. I'm not saying there's no violence against women, but it is palpable how different it is compared to, any major cities pretty much in the world. And that means a lot in terms of just, wow, as women, you can go around at night and feel like you don't have to plan every single moment of your life, being like, how am I going to get home from that meeting? How am I going to get point A to point B? If the metro stops, what can I do? That daily life, that we have to do pretty much anywhere. Here, it's a much more like relieved part. So anyways, those are some things I can think of how palpably different than what the West might say.
That's so true, because I've had so many conversations with friends about how China's so scary, like you're saying, authoritarian, and also just this concept that China is the worst to its own citizens. I think that just comes up over and over, and it's due to this like real lack of information. A lot of people that I've talked to haven't actually ever been to China and are quite scared to go. They've also never perhaps met a real Chinese person from China that
I think we're going to steal their organs.
I'll put you in like a human museum, one of those human museum things. So, and there's like a lot of deliberate disinformation on top of that, so there's like a gut feeling of fear, and there's also deliberate I guess it goes hand in hand. I love Dongsheng news. It's a very effective, positive source of information about China. Can you tell us a little bit about that project? Because it's very different, I think, from other things that I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it very much. I think this conversation is an important one because of the new Cold War moment, or against the new Cold War moment. I think Dongsheng was born out of that same desire, as we were seeing, particularly at the height of COVID, or as COVID was beginning to spread to the rest of the world, how much the misinformation was just, escalating day by day. And so many of us, some, people who are researchers, our comrades and friends from different parts of the global South, from Latin America, Asia, and some of us here in China, who follow China, just kind of got together and said, okay, we need to at least gather some information, starting with, just literally email lists of comrades and friends to get some basic information about China out, because we were saddened that it's that left, and especially lots of comrades from the global South, since they had little information, were pretty much just parroting the same lines that were coming from London or Washington, BBC, New York Times. And it almost felt like at times that we don't trust anything that the Western mainstream media says, but when it comes to China, it could be true. And so that was just quite scary. And so we just started as a newsletter of just gathering some top topics, really lead with facts, lead with information. We don't just use Chinese sources. We use sources from anywhere that we think has good information, and try to share a little bit, whether it's about, geopolitics questions, but also national politics, what's really moving in the country, people's life and culture, but also things like science and technology, because there's interesting advancements and discoveries being made here, or environmental or agricultural questions that are really urgent. So we just organize basically 10 of the top 10 top stories we think are interesting, especially for our left or progressive or global South audience, and then write the newsletter. And since then, we've expanded to do a few other things. We also tried podcasting for a while with one of other members named Mika, who's from Africa and was looking at the Africa-China perspective from an African perspective, not from the, the Western narrative of what they want to see China's role in Africa is. And we also do some, once in a while when we have time to write them, what we call the Dongsheng Explains. So these are basically trying to explain some key concepts or phenomena in China. So I mentioned the thing about why is it there homelessness or not visible, as slums? And we use that as an orienting question to say why aren't there slums in China, and explain it with a bit more historical and economic and political analysis. And then most recently, and I think it's quite an exciting project, is that we've joined with Tricontinental and a magazine called Wenhua Zongheng, which is in here in China, which is a progressive, let's say, broad left magazine. And we're just translating a couple of articles every quarter from Chinese thinkers, because we think there's a serious lack of understanding that there are Chinese debates on different pressing questions, and questions around poverty, questions around development and global issues that get left out often. There's a lot of China watchers, but there aren't many Chinese voices in the process. So we're trying to bridge. I think for us, it's really trying to bridge a huge gap that we see.
With these new articles that you're translating, are you introducing more room for sort of like the conversation and a lot of Western narrative is there's no critical thinking in China, there's no debates, there's no space to be critical about the government. So with those things, are you introducing a little bit more of that, opening it up to the West, or what's your line on that?
I mean, one of the things is that, yeah, definitely the starting point would be to be able to share some of the debates that are happening here. Because it's a large country, and there's and the socialist project it's a socialist experiment, and with every phase there's been errors and then corrections and then new paths, and China's actually a very experimental and scientific society in that sense of approaching trial and error, and then reassessing and trying. And that's also how public policy is made. You do a pilot zone, you do a test in one region, you evaluate, and then you see if you can put it on a national scale, etc. So in that sense, we want to bring some of those in and some of those nuances. And so when I said it's a broad left, you'll see, reading the articles, it's a kind of range. Some are maybe more Marxist oriented, and some are much more developmentalists in some form or other, and different varieties. And some believe very strongly in the role of the market, and etc. So we won't want to hide that. We don't want to hide, I think, even in general, the Dongsheng project, some contradictions. There's many things that were generated in this period, let's say, of the rapid economic growth of the last 4 decades, that I think even the government itself is quite, often aware or conscious of. And I think about for example, the 20th National Congress, and I encourage anyone who's interested to know where the Chinese government is thinking about its direction, or the party is thinking about its direction. There's a real recognition of huge contradictions emerging, real problems. And so yeah, I think that's part of the intention of what we want to do. I don't think it's a place to air, just anti-government messages or something like that, but broadly the different debates and discussions that are happening.
Yeah, that is such a valuable resource. People can get it, isn't it, on the Tricontinental website? People can download it. And what language is it available in, Tings, as well?
It's in English, Spanish, and Portuguese.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I've got the first edition. It's really beautiful as well, very nicely designed. And I think this is just such a valuable resource, because one of the key things that we're trying to do with the No Cold War Britain campaign is that, like you're saying, there's this real monolithic idea of China. Everyone has the same view. 1.4 billion people are all kind of brainwashed and controlled. And it's completely absurd. It's kind of pretty racist idea that there's not any free thinking or debate, and that many people could be that controlled. So it's really important to get rid of those kind of caricatures and bring in Chinese voices, a Chinese perspective, because one of the key things we're seeing is with all the censorship and the propaganda is to sort of eliminate the Chinese perspective from the discussion, or distort what the real position is and pretend it's something that it isn't. Like, for example, saying that China's pro-war when they want peace, they want development, they don't want a new Cold War or a hot war. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important to get those perspectives forward, because actually it's quite dangerous to have really distorted ideas of what China thinks, because it can actually lead to miscalculations in this very volatile world situation where we have got in the global north lots of belligerent governments that are threatening China, mm-hmm. sending warships. To kind of have an idea of what really is going on in China, and the debate in China is actually a very important thing. And it's somehow controversial as well to say we need to have a debate with China. I mean, how ridiculous is that given the size of the Chinese population? So yeah, absolutely, definitely subscribe to that journal and get a bit of perspective into some of these discussions. And the next thing we wanted to talk to you about, Tings, was you were involved in Tricontinental with producing a really valuable study called Serve the People, the Eradication of Extreme Poverty in China, which I think was published in 2021. And obviously, the fact that China has brought out hundreds of millions of people has reached the international headlines. It's recognized by the World Bank. Sometimes the Western media like to put a kind of spin on it, which is something like, at what cost? At what cost have you brought out all these hundreds of millions of people? But I don't think there's enough understanding of this process, what it means and what the impact has been on the lives of hundreds of millions of people. So I don't know if you could tell us more about this, this study that you produced and your experience of learning about how China's brought so many people out of poverty.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because when we talk about censorship, it often seems to only apply to China and Chinese censorship. And of course, there's censorship like in any government, there's censorship. That's in fact, actually, for the study, I had a chance to talk with Robert Lawrence Kuhn, who is a filmmaker from the US. Oh, he's actually a businessman from the US, but spent a lot of time in China over the last 4 decades and decided to work on a documentary about the process of poverty alleviation. And it was supposed to be a joint documentary between PBS, the public broadcaster in the US, and then CGTN, public broadcaster in China. And then eventually that got taken off the air and completely censored in the US, because we know that in this no Cold War situation, telling good stories about China and Chinese processes is somehow a threat instead of something that is desirable in terms of bridging understanding. And I think we understand the motivations for that, because there isn't actually, I think, a genuine desire from the West to find that bridging of understanding. But back to the actual the study, and I think it was really part of the motivation to do this is we were seeing these processes happening here, but we were seeing how much this was not talked about, and especially from people on the left, they didn't get access to this, and I think it does a great disservice to not be able to learn from great processes, historical processes. And so we went down to Guizhou, which is historically quite a poor province in China, and got to just see some of the experiments and talk to people, talk to party cadre, talk to peasants, women, youth, different people in the countryside and about their experiences. Because over the last 10 years or so, it was the kind of final stage of this eradication of extreme poverty, which has been happening over the many decades. But the sort of economic growth didn't necessarily reach all pockets of such a big country. And so this new sort of campaign under Xi Jinping to go to the kind of farthest reaches of the country and to ensure that every single household was lifted from extreme poverty was this effort called targeted poverty alleviation. And so, yeah, I think I would say there's three key things that we found that were really inspiring and interesting. One of them is the capacity to mobilize the party, and the party, of course, is a massive one. It's hard to conceive of, Chinese numbers are so huge, but it's a party of almost 98 million people now. It'd be the 16th most populous country if it was a country. And so there was a large mobilization of the party itself, sending 3 million party members to go and live in the countryside, working with each family. And it was really impressive to see and talk to some of the people. Really challenging work, very, very challenging. Imagine you're away from your home and your family for years at a time, really difficult conditions. So that was a big part of the campaign. And the second part is that it's not just the party on its own to do everything, or even the government alone to do everything. It's how do you mobilize the broader society, the private sector, the intellectuals and the academics, or the students, the teachers to go to the countryside, medical doctors to go to the countryside. There's a broad capacity to, led by the party, of course, to make sure that all aspects, that this was a top priority for the entire country. And I would say the third part is really, and I think why in Tricontinental we put this as part of our series on socialist construction, is that this is part of the ongoing work of socialist construction. That, of course, eliminating extreme poverty isn't the end goal. It's actually a stepping stone, a minimum program to get to the next stage of socialist development. So we understood by studying the processes more that this is part of a longer historical trajectory, but very much has a socialist character and how it was carried out. And this is the kind of thing, I think, why we haven't seen similar kinds of large and successful anti-poverty campaigns in the capitalist West nations.
One of the big motivations of the United States in the Cold War is, and it's something that certain Americans have stated officially, is that they want to stop China's economic development. And one of the key areas of this is technology, which in addition to sanctions is leading to US escalation around the Taiwan Strait, as Taiwan is a key chip manufacturer. Despite the sanctions, companies like Huawei are overcoming the obstacles that the US is putting in China's way. I was mentioning this before, that there was, I think, this publicity stunt. I assume a publicity stunt with Jackie Chan trying to get the new Huawei phone and it being sold out. Can you tell us how China is combating the economic Cold War? I mean, obviously there is awareness that it's happening. And what sort of measures are they putting in place, if any?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of maybe what we started the conversation with, when the sanctions started, and of course the technology sector was one of the first hit. It had to, I guess, China and a lot of the sort of strategic industries had to rethink a little bit about where the weaknesses are, And of course, we know that the chips was a big thing, especially the advanced microchips that China didn't have the capacity to produce. And, I think at this point, your listeners and everyone will know very well the story of Huawei and how much Huawei was completely nearly destroyed, or they tried to destroy it as like the largest 5G provider, but also of the high-end cell phones. The chip the sanctions against procurement of chips using US technology basically crippled Huawei's capacity to make these high-end cell phones and had to restructure. But another flip side of that is that it forced, and I was reading actually an interview from the CEO of Huawei recently, and saying how much this sanctions in this new Cold War moment forced its own company and its own sort of the workers to rethink a little bit and kind of band together to sort of double down. In fact, actually, a side note, Huawei is an interesting, though it's a private tech company, the CEO, only owns less than 0.1% of the shares. And the rest of the shares actually are owned by the workers themselves. So it's very interesting. That aside, is that he was saying that before the sanctions, there was kind of a malaise in the company, sort of not much motivation. There was a kind of stagnation around the innovation. Once the sanctions started coming and the sort of increased aggressions against China, there was a kind of new energized spirit of, okay, he calls it the fighting spirit. It's the word we use a lot in China, a fighting spirit. And lo and behold, I think a surprise to the whole world, while Gina Raimondo was visiting, the US Secretary of Commerce, Huawei silently puts on the website that they have a new 5G phone. And with all intents and for everything that we have been able to find out, does have this 7 nanometer microchip that China did not have. And so this is some years down the line, a huge advancement, huge breakthrough technologically that surprised most Chinese people, I think, in the world. So in some ways, that has been like a flip side of some of the technological constraints placed. It created more impetus to work around these sanctions. And I think we see this in a lot of the world too. Right now at this point, 30% of the world's population is under some kind of US unilateral sanction. Many countries, whether it's Cuba or Venezuela, had to learn to work around and I think that's why we're seeing also new kinds of alliances and relationships and I don't want to say the word blocks, but new formations, particularly of Global South, particularly of countries that have been bearing the brunt of US imperialism in the form of sanctions and warfare and whatnot, kind of coming together and thinking of other alternatives towards sovereignty. So, and that a big part is technological sovereignty and digital sovereignty. And I think we're all really happy when we saw Venezuelan President Maduro come and visit just recently. And one of the things he walked out with was with a Huawei phone. And he says, US now, try spying on me on my Huawei phone. I mean, I think it's just a nice symbol of what it means for countries in the global south still in development, and the need for technological and digital sovereignty.
Yeah, I haven't actually been back to China since the year that Beijing bid for the Olympics. So it's a really long time ago. It was before high-speed rail. I mean, can you imagine? I can't imagine that the whole high-speed rail network was developed since the last time I was in China. So I'm actually going to go there next year. Yeah.
Oh, great.
I'm like,
oh, wonderful.
It's going to be a shock, I'm sure. Well, not really that much of a shock. My parents keep going back, but I would like to hear from you, not just for my travel plans, but some like exciting things about China, like maybe outside of like the typical tech economic sector.
I mean, I think if you have a chance to visit, definitely don't stay in the major cities and, the Beijings and Shanghais, and actually have a chance to go to the smaller cities or go to the countryside specifically. I think that's where some of the biggest transformations have been happening. And for me, even though I didn't grow up here and didn't live in mainland China and coming from the side of Hong Kong, over the last 30 years, visiting family in Guangdong province and seeing the changes are really significant, and sometimes I think Western media likes to sort of scoff at it, but it helps you remember that China is still a developing country and very much, for example, the whole thing about, I don't know if you've heard before, about the toilet revolution, how much the government invested in improving the sanitary, conditions and bathrooms is such a real thing in the lives of people. And I remember the last time I went and I took my partner to my grandfather's village, and we, all my family members, they were showing us 2 or 3 different like public bathroom facilities that were newly constructed and how nice they were. It's something that people actually have a lot of pride in, and that like sanitation and like a clean, hygienic waste facilities is actually really important for the global south and the developing world. But sometimes this is kind of, I don't know. I've seen a lot of things in the media, Western media, against the toilet development as one example. But that being said, I'm not saying go visit all the toilets. That's not my take-home message. My take-home message is go to the countryside, see for yourself, see how people are living. And now I think in the phase after the campaign to eradicate extreme poverty is now enter this, what's being called as the rural revitalization, because these are really big questions about, I think, across the world. How do you bridge this urban-rural divide? How do you create conditions and so that people from the countryside don't necessarily have to migrate to cities for the comforts of like a modern life, let's say, or for work? How do you think about questions of agricultural modernization in the context of climate change, in the context of many sort of environmental questions? So these are kind of experiments now happening a lot in the countryside of how to confront the rural question in the 21st century. So I think that's quite exciting. And also I think in another maybe more sort of cultural realm, it's really nice to see young people sort of embracing Chinese culture. You'll see one thing if you go to a city like Xi'an, which of course is a very ancient city. You'll see a lot of young people sort of dressing up in what's called hanfu or traditional clothes. And it's just a part of like re-embracing a kind of modern China, but at the same time, understanding the cultural roots. And it's something quite vibrant happening on that cultural level right now. And if I can add one more thing to see, and I haven't got to see some of my friends went, is also in the countryside now. It's very, rural sports are very popular right now. So we just had the Village Basketball Association finals, and that was something very organized by peasants and farmers, and became a national sensation. Tens of thousands of people went down to Guizhou to see this like village basketball associations and village soccer league. So there's also a revival of let's say of rural culture and rural life that I think is quite exciting to see, because so much of what we think as cultural production is urban focused or has this bias that that's where culture is formed. But how do we also sort of give value to and reinvent rural culture as well?
Oh, that's really fascinating, Tings, because I mean, one of the kind of key things now that absolute poverty has been eliminated, that there's a lot of discussion about in China, is the struggle for common prosperity, because there is inequality in China. And it's very interesting to hear what you're saying about these developments in rural situations. Does that kind of relate to this whole kind of struggle for common prosperity, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we know one of the things is that the questions around inequality, which are, in fact, this is what in a government or, party terms is the principal contradiction that China is facing right now, is the question of unequal and inadequate development, which is really about inequality. And that's not just the rural-urban divide, that's also between regions, because some regions were much more focused on for industrialization policies in the opening reform period. How do we balance that out, let's say? But one of the things we know is that, cities like this one, 20 plus million people, or Shanghai or others, can't infinitely grow. That's not actually a sustainable model for any country to develop. We actually have to create ways that smaller cities can develop, that there's enough incentives that people want to move to smaller cities. And also what I had mentioned previously, that the revitalization of the countryside is key to that, not only because the countryside, feeds the country, but also around, the close ties that people still have to the countryside. Everyone's just one generation or less removed from the countryside here. And there had been a kind of hollowing out of a lot of that during the rapid economic growth, where hundreds of people basically migrated into cities to work. So now is the time to think, what is the development in the countryside for the future? But this happens across many aspects. And in terms of the inequality, there's been quite a lot of focus on what's called the sort of three mountains that Chinese people are facing around increasing costs, especially in the cities, around housing, healthcare, and education. So we're seeing different types of policies trying to target some of the parts, particularly the parts that have been privatized, or the role of some monopolies in these areas, and restructuring a lot of the key, the key aspects of people's lives. So it's happening on many aspects of how to get towards this vision of a common, prosperous society.
Well, it's been really fascinating to hear about these really significant developments domestically within China that you've just been explaining. And that's something that really isn't well understood in Britain. So I really appreciate sharing all these points. But another issue that really isn't understood is Chinese foreign policy. It's one of the things that is actually quite smeared a lot. So a lot of the Western media creates this image that China is the aggressor, that it's intent on world domination, is an emerging imperialist power, is trying to colonize Africa and Latin America. And I just wanted you to sort of respond to these. How would you respond to these assumptions? And could you give us an explanation of what China's foreign policy really is?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an urgent question, because it's interesting. The countries that are really accusing China of being a new colonial force or a new imperialist force are the very countries that actually were colonizers and actually imperialist forces. So that we always should hold with a little bit of suspicion, but they do have the dominance over the kind of global narrative, right? But one of the things I think fundamentally China emerges as a country of the third world, of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, of the colonized world, and never grew, even in when we see this rise of China, never grew out of the same way that the Western societies, which is hundreds of years of colonialism, genocide, and slavery, and territorial invasion of other countries. That is just historically untrue. So there's that as the basis from which China emerges. And I think this is also why we are seeing a stronger and stronger sort of affirmations. And we saw this at the BRICS Plus summit in Johannesburg just recently, where President Xi Jinping was reaffirming very much that China is of the global south, comes from the global south, and will always be part of the global south as its historical trajectory, right? Even if it is now, depending if you use purchasing power parity or not, already either the first or the second largest economy. That's a historical understanding of where China comes from. And I think it informs a lot of its foreign policy today. Of course, China's foreign policy is very much, around this idea of the non-interference, the principles of peaceful coexistence that comes out of the Bandung moment in the 1950s and really solidifies as part of China's foreign policy. But I don't want this to mean that China doesn't act or is somehow passive and just sits by and lets things happen. Certainly, to me, it's quite bizarre, this idea of China as being aggressor, or trying to get, trying to become a militaristic power or invading, because that's just not the history. Even, we haven't really fought a hot war in 40 years or something like that. And the track record of every Western country or any NATO country or G7 country speaks for itself, who actually engages and starts wars. But what I think China's foreign policy today is important, especially for the global South. It is using its capacity now as a strong country to build new multilateral and regional platforms. And that's really, I think, where China is acting, and not, and you can say that's interference or non-interference, but it is something that is creating opportunities for global South countries that have been just historically excluded from the decision-making tables, while being on the receiving end of unfavorable policies, unfavorable structural adjustment programs, and everything that we've seen after our so-called independence in the neoliberal era. And so we're seeing things, BRICS, and I know a lot of people on the left have suspicions because it's not a left enough project, it's not an anti-imperialist project, but it is a project that now represents over 40% of the world population and nearly the same amount of the global GDP and production. This is not a kind of alliance or grouping that we can omit or ignore. Maybe it's not the anti-imperialist front it is, but it's a platform for countries to actually think about how to get out of the stranglehold of the dollar hegemony. How to find a pathway where we can actually get financing or trade, even just in our own currencies. That's absurd to think that's not possible in our current framework. But that's part of anti-imperialism today. That's actually part of a non-militaristic solution to think about how countries can actually be more sovereign and have a bit more say in their own path forward. But we're also seeing other things. BRI, now celebrating its 10-year anniversary, the Belt and Road Initiative, has been an important possibility, option for global South countries to get financing, get bridges, get ports, get airports, the basic things that global South countries are needing. And I think a lot of the West like to smear this because, first of all, I don't think they have any capacity to build anything and actually compete with China in actually delivering anything. We've heard many acronyms, the Build Back Better World and the PGII, and every year it's a new thing, but nothing gets built ever. So you have to smear it, and say this is a colonial force. But when you ask the countries themselves and the leaders themselves that are choosing this option, they're saying, okay, the West has failed to provide us any meaningful options, and we are going with China. And there's this enduring colonial mentality, paternalism, to say, global South countries can't choose a different path, and a path that China is helping to pave. So anyways, I could go on and on, but I think that's an important part to understand China's relationship or kind of foreign policy that sometimes, I guess, this gets dismissed as only about trade or only about development. When you talk to global South countries, that's not an only, that's a priority, that's strategic, and that's a fundamental thing in order to actually achieve any kind of national sovereignty and dignity for the people. So I get very passionate about this topic and I ramble.
No, absolutely. The difference between, a very powerful country respecting sovereignty of other countries and not is massive, One thing we did want to ask you, because you are the director of the Tricontinental Institute, and you make some really wonderful, impactful and inspiring images which inspire the movement. And obviously we go back to 1966, the Cuban people hosted the Tricontinental Conference of movements from Africa, Asia, Latin America. And one of the things coming out of that conference was the Organization of Solidarity with the Peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, which operated out of Havana. And a key contribution of this organisation was to produce some really amazing posters which supported and inspired the international movements for peace and national independence, and really iconic kind of images. And I'm just wondering, as we've got you here, you know, to take the opportunity to ask you, what inspiration can we take from that project today? And more broadly, what do you think the role of art is in the movement against war, but past, present, and future?
No, I'm glad you managed to sneak in a question of art and culture, which I'm very passionate about, not just China. It's an and, not a but. But I think is one of the things that's really in terms of looking back at this history of particularly on the national liberation struggles of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, I'd say starting in the 1940s, and China was a part of that, all the way to maybe South Africa as one of the last major national liberation struggles in the 80s. This is a moment where people's movements were strong, a national project was strong, and also international solidarity was strong. And the reason of looking back at this is not a nostalgic endeavor, and I'm actually not that interested in just feeling good about our past. And I really love the quote, and I always think a lot about the quote from Frantz Fanon, who says that we have to look at the past as a basis of hope and action for the future. Looking at the past gives us some some guideposts of what we did, what we achieved, and also where we are going from here on. And I think reviving a lot of the artistic, cultural elements is an important part, because that's what stimulates a lot of the solidarity and internationalism, and that spirit of internationalism that I think we're trying today, as anyone who's on the left or anyone who's part of a global anti-war movement needs to build. And so sort of reviving that cultural tradition. But it's also about how we act in that today. So that's why we look at experiences of Cuba. We've done some research around, Indonesia before the coup and the subsequent massacre of communists. We've looked at also China's early agrarian reform period and the culture that came out of that. Now I just finished up one research project on an exiled group of artists from South Africa during the anti-apartheid and the struggles for South Africa liberation. So that I think is part of the inspiration to think about now. And I would say, going off of the previous question around the foreign policy and what is now we call the global South, but in the previous iteration was the third world, is that project of national liberation, I firmly believe, hasn't been completed, especially because we haven't gotten rid of imperialism. And that as long as that continues, and it's also associated wars in many forms that it has over, sovereign peoples and nations, we will never actually get to that liberation of people and the dignity that we're looking for, that we were seeking even 100 years ago till now. So that is also I think part of reviving that history is also seeing us in that continuous historical process. And of course, sometimes I think because of so much of the anti-communist or anti-left dominant narrative, we don't have access to the histories of liberation, and then also the cultural works and the cultural theories that really help mobilize. We've done this before. We've mobilized global anti-war movements. We've mobilized against fascism. We've mobilized, and so being able to relink to that past to kind of fuel our present is really important.
Yeah. On that note, what would you recommend for people to read to sort of inform, inspire us in this anti-war? Saying anti-war fight seems wrong, but you know what I mean.
It's kind of weird to promote your own thing, but since it's not my actual writing, I would recommend, because it's hot off the shelf, is the third issue of the Wenhua Zonghang, which is around the Belt and Road Initiative 10 years, but a specific focus on Africa, China. And we have perspectives from China and also from Africa to think about what these last 10 years have been. And I think actually, because the question about China's role in Africa is so dominant today, and a lot of the misinformation and the ideas around China's aggressiveness or militarism, it's important to understand that better from the Chinese and African perspectives. So you can download it in Tricontinental's website or Dongsheng website.
Before we wrap up, I just have to say, I listened to all of the Crane, it's the African, and from what you said earlier, it sounds like it's no longer I was waiting for the new season of this podcast.
Right now it's in the process of being rethought about, perhaps maybe with a more global South broader focus. So it's in the assessment phase, but I think it'll come back in some form or other.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, that's what we're discussing now.
Okay, cool.
But I'm very glad
that.
to hear that you like it a lot. I'll definitely share it.
I mean, because it really informed me about, I was quite ignorant about that area. And although when I was in China, there were a lot of African students when I was studying Chinese. I mean, not that that means anything personal lived experience, but it was nice to hear, you know, from a more erudite perspective what was going on. So So thank you so much for coming on our show. And I think I have to say something about liking and subscribing. So for other people. Thank you and see you next time.
Thanks so much, Tings, for joining me.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.